The Vatican messenger arrived in Ouagadougou at precisely 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning, carrying documents that would transform Ibrahim Traoré from a military leader into something unprecedented in modern African politics. A bridge between faiths that could unite a continent divided by religious differences. Cardinal Peter Turkin, the Ghanaian prefect and the Pope's special envoy to Africa, was waiting in the presidential palace's private chapel as Traoré arrived for his morning prayers. "President Traoré," Cardinal Turkin began, "His Holiness has sent me with a proposal that may surprise you." Traoré, dressed in simple civilian clothes, gestured for him to continue. "The Vatican has been observing your leadership style, your commitment to justice, and, most importantly, your ability to unite people across traditional divisions. The Holy Father believes you may be called to a role that extends beyond political leadership." The cardinal opened a leather portfolio containing documents with the papal seal. "Pope Francis is inviting you to become the first African leader to serve as a continental advocate for unity, a spiritual leader for African Christians while maintaining your political authority." Traoré's expression remained cautious. "I'm honored by His Holiness's confidence, but I'm not ordained clergy. How could I serve in a spiritual leadership role?" "That's exactly why this role is being created," Cardinal Turkin replied. "Traditional religious hierarchies have sometimes struggled to address Africa's political and economic challenges. The Holy Father believes that combining spiritual authority with political experience could create unprecedented unity." Traoré studied the documents. The role was part diplomat, part evangelist, and part continental visionary, coordinating Christian responses to African challenges, mediating religious conflicts across denominations, and using Christian principles to strengthen African unity rather than division. The most significant aspect was revealed in the final document. The Vatican was prepared to support African Christian independence from European denominational control. Local churches, local leadership, and local decision-making would be guided by universal Christian principles, but adapted to African realities. For centuries, African Christianity had largely been controlled by European churches and European interpretations of doctrine. Now the Vatican was offering to support African autonomy. "His Holiness believes," Cardinal Turkin continued, "that African Christian leaders are best positioned to address African challenges." Traoré knew this would create complications in a religiously diverse continent. "Cardinal, Burkina Faso is 63% Muslim. How would my acceptance of a Christian leadership role affect relations with African Islamic communities?" "That's the most important part," the Cardinal said. "His Holiness isn't asking you to become exclusively a Christian leader. He's asking you to become a model for how religious leaders can serve all their people, regardless of faith." He pulled out communications showing unprecedented interfaith cooperation quietly supported by the Vatican. Discussions had already begun with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to create parallel roles for African Islamic leaders. The goal? Complementary leadership that strengthens African unity rather than fuels competition. "Show me the Islamic component," Traoré requested. The documents revealed that Grand Imam Ahmed Al-Taibe of Al-Azhar had been developing similar proposals for Islamic leadership. African Islamic leaders would focus on prosperity rather than global religious politics. "President Traoré," the Cardinal added, "there's also been outreach to African traditional religious leaders. They want to be part of this cooperation rather than marginalized by it." This was the missing piece. Interfaith unity would include Christianity, Islam, and traditional African religions. 3 days later, Grand Imam Mohammed Diko arrived in Ouagadougou with a proposal that mirrored the Vatican's vision. "Brother Ibrahim," he said informally, "I come with greetings from Al-Azhar and a proposal that may surprise you as much as the Vatican's offer. You would serve simultaneously as a Christian advocate and an Islamic mediator, not converting between faiths, but demonstrating that true leadership serves all believers." Traoré studied the documents. Al-Azhar had been developing African Islamic autonomy, local interpretations of Islamic law, local decision-making, and coordination with Christian communities to reduce division. But the most important element, Imam Diko emphasized, is cooperation, not competition. Across Nigeria, Kenya, and Morocco, Christian and Islamic leaders are already working together to address poverty, education, and ethnic tension. "What role would I play?" Traoré asked. "Demonstrate that political leadership can bridge religious divisions rather than exploit them. Show that African leaders can serve all their people without compromising their own faith." Just as Traoré was processing this, his aide announced another visitor. Chief Nabaki Shoniba, one of Burkina Faso's most respected traditional religious leaders. "Our ancestor spirits call for unity. Christian, Islamic, and traditional leaders are here because the divine works through all paths to heal our continent." The chief's documents showed coordination across Africa, from Senegal to Kenya, Egypt to South Africa. His proposal? Honor traditional African spirituality as the foundation upon which Christianity and Islam had built. Not competition, but recognition that all faiths serve the same African people. Traoré realized the potential. For the first time, African religious leadership could align with African development rather than global politics. But the celebrations were short-lived. Colonel Odugro brought alarming intelligence. European and Middle Eastern authorities are coordinating to prevent African religious independence. Conservative factions in the Vatican, Saudi Arabia, and European Protestant churches are conspiring to maintain control. American evangelical organizations and conservative Islamic authorities are also mobilizing. "They're treating African religious independence as a threat," Cardinal Turkin observed. "If African Christians and Muslims make their own decisions, other regions will demand the same autonomy," Imam Diko added. Chief Nabaki Shoneba nodded. They feared that unified African spirituality will expose how external control has weakened our communities. Then Traoré received a message from Pope Francis himself. "I am aware that conservative elements within the Church oppose African religious independence. I personally support your efforts to unite African spiritual communities. The Vatican officially supports African religious autonomy." Messages of support arrived from progressive leaders worldwide. Traoré realized the opposition came from conservative factions benefiting from dependency. 2 weeks later, the crisis escalated. Extremist groups staged coordinated attacks across 3 African countries, designed to prove interfaith unity impossible. In Burkina Faso, Christian soldiers attacked a mosque in Ouagadougou, killing 23. In Mali, Islamic purifiers bombed a church in Bamako, killing 31. In Ghana, traditional warriors attacked both a church and mosque, killing 19. Colonel Odugro reported, "Weapons, military-grade explosives, sophisticated communication, bank-financed operations, professional training. These attacks aren't organic, they're orchestrated." Forensic analysis shocked everyone. Attackers were foreign mercenaries misrepresenting their religious identities to provoke conflict. The extremists were fakes, manufactured to justify preventing African religious cooperation. Imam Diko arrived for an emergency interfaith meeting. The battle for Africa's soul was about to turn violent, but for the first time, real interfaith leadership stood ready to defend unity. Cardinal Turkin reviews intelligence from Vatican sources. The Holy Father had suspected this might happen. Conservative elements warned him that supporting African religious independence would lead to violence. Now they were creating that violence to prove their point. Chief Nabaki Shoniba studies forensic reports with growing outrage. These mercenaries desecrated sacred spaces and murdered innocent people to serve the political goals of distant authorities who want to maintain control over African spirituality. Traoré receives a call that transforms the situation. President Tanubu, voice. President Traoré, we've made arrests in connection with the religious attacks. What we have discovered will shock you. What have you found? The financing comes from
50,000 religious leaders representing every African faith gather in a massive tent complex. Intelligence from 32 African nations prevents extremist infiltration. International religious observers document the event. Brothers and sisters, we gather not to choose between our faiths, but to demonstrate that our faiths can choose Africa's prosperity over external control. Thunderous, unified applause from the crowd. It is time for African Christianity to contribute its wisdom to global Christianity, rather than simply receiving direction from distant authorities. African Islam should lead global Islam in demonstrating how faith serves social development. Now all three traditions can work together to honor the divine while serving African people. Launch of the African Interfaith Development Initiative. Today, we announce the African Interfaith Development Initiative, $50 billion in community resources dedicated to education, healthcare, and economic development across Africa. Funding came directly from African churches, mosques, and traditional communities, pooling resources for continental development rather than sending contributions abroad. African Christians fund schools. African Muslims fund hospitals. Traditional communities fund agriculture. The economic impact is staggering. Resources previously flowing out of Africa now support local development. International recognition. The Catholic Church recognizes the right of African Christians to adapt teachings to African realities. African Muslims understand African challenges better than distant authorities. We support African Islamic leadership. Progressive authorities worldwide publicly support African religious autonomy. The African model inspires global religious independence movements. Economic warfare. International religious organizations are coordinating to cut funding and isolate African leaders promoting interfaith cooperation. The funding cuts aren't coming from official church sources, they're from conservative factions opposing reform. Activate the African Religious Independence Fund. $73 billion contributed by African religious communities across all faiths, now directly supporting African religious independence. The fund enables churches, mosques, and traditional communities to operate independently and finance development projects. Global human rights intervention. Suppression attempts in Cameroon, Ivory Coast, and Senegal trigger international response. Suppressing religious independence movements violates international human rights law. The global human rights community reframes religious independence as a universal freedom issue. Support pours in from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and progressive religious authorities worldwide. Formalizing global religious autonomy.
6 months later, UN headquarters, New York.